David, I think we discussed last week that the main Crowdsource the Truth YouTube channel, the Jason Goodman channel, has just been reactivated in terms of its ability to live stream. So we've got a lot of viewers this week. Obviously, everybody is home, very concerned about the worldwide pandemic, the state of emergency that basically everyone is under. How are you today, David?
I'm very well and so far unscathed, although the people around me, particularly the people who work at the kind of places I frequent, they're terrified. Many of them, I think, have been laid off, and we're going to have to, well, at least I believe we can make a contribution to removing some of the unthoughtful panic, if that's the right word.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, David, because based on the numbers and the details that we've been given by the so-called experts on TV, you're actually, just from a demographic standpoint, you're right in the high risk category, but you're not fearful of the virus at all, are you?
Well, I mean, there's no reason why they shouldn't target me. I mean, they've targeted me in other ways, but I believe that being fearful of something you don't understand is foolhardy. It's much better that you learn to understand what the risks are and who's operating the risks, and then do something about it, which is what I hope we can do, through the show.
Yeah. And just earlier today, well, I think it might even be happening right now, U.S. President Donald Trump was having one of his coronavirus task force press conferences. A medical expert speaking on behalf of the task force said that the United States and Italy had their patient zero incident at about the same time. I think he said December or January. So I'm confused by all the people who are telling me that, going to the hospitals and everything around New York City is irresponsible, because a doctor outside of a hospital yesterday told me that it's already been spread. The doctor wasn't wearing a mask. We're getting so much conflicting information. None of it makes sense. And David, for people who are seeing us for the first time today and maybe don't know about our regular Friday show on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and Subscribestar and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, we're going to today go over things in a way that's going to reiterate some extremely important ideas for our regular viewers and introduce new viewers to this concept of a supranational elite organization of world bankers and intellectuals who consider themselves elites, who basically are, and when we say supranational, David, I think some people have already been confused, because somebody might have looked at it quickly and thought we're talking about a supernatural organization, which we're not. We're talking about ordinary humans, no magical powers, no superheroes, but an organization that supersedes the sovereignty of any individual nation and involves people from multiple nations and multiple organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that language comes straight from David Rockefeller. And if you just flip to the sort of the opening image that you put together, which is, I think, absolutely brilliant, it'll help people perhaps put a face on some of these characters that might represent the supranational government.
Yes.
So over on the right, we've got David Rockefeller, right, who died at 101. He had a long innings, but he is quoted from memory as something to the effect that the world is ready to move to a supranational government of an intellectual elite and world bankers, which is presumably, in his words, preferable to the auto-determination of the sovereign state. Now, he's being, in that particular quote, very grateful to the Washington Post and New York Times and other so-called illustrious media publications. And of course, the Washington Post is of interest to you because that's where the Mendenhall baby reference disappeared. So our audience probably won't, many of them won't know what we mean by it. We can come back to that.
Well, but to
anyway,
briefly touch on that, David, I don't know if we want to go off on the tangent, but it is important, because that whole issue with Mendenhall's baby and the Washington Post, you and I were talking about steganographic coded messages, coded messages in plain sight that are used to communicate across this broad network, this supranational organization of criminal elites. And certainly publishing something in the Washington Post is a way for it to be seen internationally, particularly in 1979, at a time when internet communications and Twitter and all this stuff didn't exist. So it's relevant to what we're going to discuss today, and it's also relevant because you're talking peripherally about the attacks that you and I have experienced from social engineers, people that want to present a story to the public to convince them that a falsehood is true and some truth is false in order to engineer society in a direction that is desirable to the social engineers, but perhaps undesirable to the targets of the social engineering campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ground truthing concept, we can develop that a little more. But going back into the 1980s, when I had been up to 1981 coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research for a company called Schlumberger in Connecticut, and developed techniques at the laboratory actually for ground truthing theories relating to big data sets. And actually, I went ahead and built systems. I wrote a paper, thank you for showing that, an analysis of expert thinking. That was published in the International Journal of Man-Machine Studies in 1983, and I'm kind of proud of it. Apparently, the person, my friend who was doing research with me in AI, he looked at it and said, "David, why don't you put a comma in?" You know, basically, I'd free thought it, right? So it was totally unreadable, and actually, it has succeeded in putting some quite illustrious thinkers to sleep. But that's all right. I'm a humble man, as you know. Anyway, so back in 1981, I was very concerned in the oil industry about how you ground truth a theory that pops up from a petroleum geologist or a petrophysicist or a geophysicist. So I went ahead, fast forward, in 1988, I'd actually built a system for Brit Oil in Glasgow that allowed you to hypothesize about whether or not there was oil there. And the machine would actually create synthetic or simulated data that you could compare with actual data. So you've been around some of the hospitals in New York, wondering about this amazing spread of this amazing disease associated with the coronavirus. And effectively, whether you knew it or not, I think you were ground truthing the implications of the theory related to the spread of the coronavirus, which is generally built around the idea of a patient zero going into a geographic area, and through her or his contacts with people, maybe in a pub or a coffee bar or whatever, or a gym, how rapidly such a patient zero infection might spread through the community. And what is fascinating is the documentary put out by the BBC called Contagion, exclamation mark, put out in 2018. I would say, to congratulate the BBC, it is actually a superb documentary, right, that relates to the injection of a digital virus on the woman who's sort of handling the show, and she's a mathematician, very bright, obviously, and she was carrying a cell of a personal phone that had a digital virus put in it. And what they did is they tracked the volunteers who came into her orbit, if you will, in a little town called Hazelmere in England. And the two mobiles would then communicate if they were sufficiently close for a sufficiently long period of time. So the other party would be, so to speak, digitally infected or virtually infected. Mm-hmm. And then they followed the spread of the virus, the digital virus, if you will, in Hazelmere. I think they had 500 volunteers, and then they moved on to 6,000 volunteers for the country as a whole. And what they showed was the spread of the virus, and it was absolutely fantastic. But very largely, and not unexpectedly, it was clustered around the movements of patient zero, the digital patient zero. So I compare that simulation with what we're learning about, for example, the spread of COVID-19, which is what I would call hotspots. So there is a hotspot in Wuhan City, Hubei province, don't know if I got the pronunciation right, which initially was alleged to have been from the wild animal market, and they were speculating that it was being transferred from bats or civet cats or whatever turned the crank of the food taste of the Chinese. But you see, when I look at that with my background in simulation and ground truthing in the oil industry, I say there's something wrong there. That is to say, the assumptions made by the BBC in Contagion exclamation mark was that this was driven by a patient zero. And I think, as far as I know, the assumptions being made by the pundits, the intellectual elite, and the world bankers, that the present COVID-19 is driven by a patient zero, unidentified patient zero, going into Wuhan city. But I'm saying the data is telling you something else. That is to say, the model assumption is wrong, whether you call it false or not, because it's far more likely that there were multiple people, whether wittingly or unwittingly, introducing the virus into Wuhan city to create the density or critical mass of viruses in Wuhan city, such that you got this hotspot where it, to a large extent. Then another one pops up in Italy, then in Iran, and there are various places around the world where the model, in my opinion, of the patient zero falls apart. There has to be another theory. And that's where the template comes in that I've designed and developed, and it's up on my site where people can download it and look at the template. And if I can just read the title of that document, it's 2 pages, it's free, it can be downloaded. It's titled Free Download Template for Licensed Vector Analysis of Third-Party Crime Scene Investigation Scripts, where patent custodians have staged live action role play. So you've forgiven me a long time ago for being verbose, right?
I have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. But the essence of that is anyone can download this template and look at the 10 patents that I think are crucial to create actually a criminal attack on a sovereign community or a city where there are people going in or being sent in or paid to go in to a given geographical area who have quite possibly been vaccinated against the coronavirus or COVID-19 and paid to go in, let's say, to the wild animal market in Wuhan city and spread the virus. They may not even know that they're carrying the virus. They may leave, maybe they've got multiple reasons, tourists or whatever, to go to that market. They come out again, they're protected because they've been vaccinated. And then the world says, oh, we've got a virus that's jumped from the wild animal market into the human chain. Let's everyone panic.
Yeah.
But the way it's being spread, someone, let's call it a hidden hand, is directing the virus into certain areas for strategic reasons or foreign policy reasons. So what intrigues me is a quote from Lord Palmerston, late very famous British Prime Minister. He said something to the effect, we have no permanent friends or eternal allies. We only have permanent and eternal interests, and it is our duty to serve them. So again, I don't want to hop you around too much, but if you just flip to my map, you know, the master map, if you will, when people go to reverse CSI scripts, I think this map, even though I didn't intend it necessarily to echo the words of Lord Palmerston, that map essentially shows that the foreign policy of the British Empire has been for centuries that we have no permanent friends or eternal allies. We only have permanent and eternal interest. Now, this map is extraordinary. I'm sorry about, in some cases, the resolution is not as good as the best I could do with my limited skill sets, right? This is a map that shows the world connected through what was known as the All Red Line, which essentially is the underwater cable system, that I think is the turn of the 19th century, where the first link from Ireland to Newfoundland was laid, I believe, around 1848. But by the time of the First World War, the British Empire had a complete and redundant real-time links around the colonies, if you will. And it was in a position, for example, to front run a major crisis. So if merino wool sheep began to die in Australia because of the drought conditions, the word would reach London, and the big financial markets and investors could basically buy merino wool in a long campaign, knowing that the price would go up. Fast forward to the present, if someone knew that the stock market would go down 3,500 points, they could jump in early and short the market.
Seems like somebody
So
did
it'd be
that, David. TruePundit.com is reporting this morning that Chi-Fi, of all people, Dianne Feinstein, who in 2018 or 19 was found to have a Chinese spy working as her chauffeur. I don't really know if people who represent us in Congress should have chauffeurs. That's not very representative of the average American. And I also don't think having $6 million in stock is very representative of the average American. She sounds more like a financial elite.
right. Well, so just going back to the images of those individuals that you started with, the picture that started with David Rockefeller. Let's pick up some of the other characters and see whether or not David Rockefeller's dream of a supranational government of an intellectual elite and world bankers is coming to fruition. Because something is happening when sovereign states are actually locked down, and people over 70 in some countries are being told to stay at home. And I think you pointed out yesterday, you saw a few military personnel armed
Yep.
to the teeth, maybe I misinterpreted you, wandering around. What are they about to enforce? Are they about to enforce the orders of a supranational government? Anyway, so we've got David Rockefeller, and behind David Rockefeller, you've got two gold keys. One is marked Phi Beta Kappa, and the other is marked Kappa Beta Phi. Now, those are two secret societies. Certainly back in 1776, when they're established, they are very powerful, and I believe that they were established by British intelligence.
Now,
Now,
hang on a second.
1770s.
We should reiterate this, David. 1776, the establishment of Phi Beta Kappa. A lot of people seem to think that Phi Beta Kappa is just a fraternal order, a scholarly, what would you call it? It's an intellectual society, right?
It describes itself nowadays as an academic honors society, right? And so there's really interesting characters who are Phi Beta Kappa, including Jane Addams, who was actually staying at Toynbee Hall in 1888 with her girlfriend, Ellen Starr, and she was within walking distance to the 5 canonical murders associated with Jack the Ripper. So you and I walked around on the Ripper tour, which I found absolutely fascinating. Brilliant Cockney. He was telling us all the details. And I think I said to him, has there ever been any word of a possible Jane the Ripper? Because Jane Addams and Ellen Starr within walking distance of the 5 canonical murders and could have been dressed as men and got out of the crimes. Anyway, I digress.
Sorry,
perhaps.
David. Forgive
So
my
Phi Beta,
ignorant question. I should have asked this long ago. But if I don't know, there's people listening who don't know. What does canonical mean?
oh, it means representative. I mean, the 5 canonical murders would be the ones who were eviscerated. Their guts were cut. They had their bowels thrown over their shoulder. In the particular case of Mary Jane Kelly, and she's one of the women on the medallions of my map that I showed you earlier. So she is besides a woman called, I think, Angela Joesbury. Now yes, if you can zoom in, over on the right of the clock, you see Mary Jane Kelly, and then Andrea Joesbury. Now, people, I think I'm unique in having you to communicate this. I think this is astonishing, because if I ask people, what do you think Mary Jane Kelly and Angela Joesbury have in common, they probably wouldn't know. And it
David,
took me a
Alec
long
Polk is
time.
telling us that the Illuminati was created in 1776. I think he's talking about the Bavarian Society. I should also remind people, David, if they become sponsors of patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, or subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. They're going to be able to go back and see that walking tour that you and I took through London. There's a series of videos that we did in London that are available exclusively to our sponsors. We went and visited the BBC, and we're going to be talking later today at 2 p.m. Eastern about the BBC's role in this viral spread. The real pandemic, in my view, is the misinformation and the overreaction of the news. They've been padding the runway the entire time by saying if they get accused of overreacting, that's good. I mean, they've created this sort of mysterious and deadly, unknown, invisible enemy, and that way, if you don't get it, they can say, oh, see, we did a great job, you didn't get it. It's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, totally. And again, although it's not done with intent in the oil industry, with these complex data sets, there's a lot of disagreement from geologists and petrophysicists and geophysicists about what is below the reservoir. Just like with a crime, there's a lot of disagreement about who killed the women in the Ripper murders.
And
right?
if I may, David, I think when diagnosing a patient, there's a lot of disagreement among doctors, their techniques, their conclusions, etc. I found this item in preparing for the show. This is from 2017, and it's about a girl from Mississauga in Canada. I guess is that near Ontario, Mississauga?
Yeah.
The girl lost 2 limbs after an infection that the doctors thought was influenza. Now, influenza is a pretty common virus, and you would expect in a modern country like Canada, which is often, touted to people in the United States as having a fantastic government-supplied, free for everybody, socialized healthcare system. Here we have, obviously mistakes happen, but this is the type of thing that the average person who goes to the doctor and they tell them you have the flu, you don't think too much of it, but this looks like a pretty young and healthy girl who's now had limbs amputated due to a misdiagnosis. So I wanted everybody to see this because the mainstream news is highlighting things that are, quite frankly, alarmist, and I don't want people to become alarmed. We've got a very serious situation happening here in that businesses have shut down, people are concerned about their jobs. I'm very concerned about that, and that's one part of our conversation, but this idea that there's this deadly viral pandemic, and if you go outside your house, you're likely to contract something that, even if you're healthy, you're going to kill somebody else. So stay inside.
Well, this is classical resilience news injects put together by Serco for the United Kingdom Cabinet Office at a place called Hawk Hills.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because a lot of people watching are not going to be familiar with that Serco resilience testing. Give everyone just a brief overview, if you would, David, why we're so interested in Serco and how it plays into this supranational government idea.
Yeah, well, very quickly, Serco grew out of RCAGB 1929, Radio Corporation of America 1929. So it would be a child of David Sarnoff, right, who ran Radiation America for decades. So RCAGB 1929 got some interesting contracts for the British government and the UK Cabinet Office, including providing a 4-minute warning to the British citizens of an attack, from an intercontinental ballistic missile. My concern, of course, is who do they give that warning to? Because if they give it to an elite that can retreat into the basement of a luxury hotel, the peasants are going to get fried on the outside. Now, going forward, RCAGB 1929 has a management buyout in 1988 and an IPO, initial public offering, of 1989, staged or structured by N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, which happens to be the company or the bank that Wilbur Ross is working for, who's now the Commerce Secretary. So I believe Wilbur Ross would have known precisely how to structure RCAGB 1929 into Serco by 1989, and then structure Serco so somehow or other it's got the most amazing contracts for the American government. This is a British company that has been accused of fraud in relation to prisoner tracking. But during 1994, the Clinton administration outsourced the operation, wait for it, of the United States National Visa Center to Serco. That allowed Serco, I believe, to bring in the Al-Qaeda sleeper cells into the United States and disperse them around the country, ready for subsequent attacks, right, which would include 911.
Yeah.
So there's Wilbur Ross, right, and he is Kappa Beta Phi.
But he didn't want to talk about Serco, David. I asked him directly about Serco controlling the U.S. Patent Office, and he deflected the question, didn't want to discuss it. I should have asked him about Kappa Beta Phi and what he did as the grand swipe and what he's doing with all the weird shoes that he wears, right?
Well, the grand swipe to me sounds like, he's about to steal large amounts of money, right? I'm not accusing him of theft, but what I do find remarkable is that having outsourced the United States Patent and Trademark Office, so it's not just the National Visa Center, they've outsourced the United States Patent and Trademark Office to the same company. They also outsourced the Defense Ammunition Center. And anyway, it goes on and on. There's a long litany, and one of the summaries of our discussions, I believe, is that I think Serco should be stripped out of every United States government contract, including providing command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, and surveillance and reconnaissance system to the United States Navy. Anyway, moving on.
But wait, before we move on, I want to reiterate this for people, because sometimes you are sending so much information at people, it's difficult for them to absorb. But we need to contemplate what this means. Our government has moved over the years more and more, the United States government and the military has moved much more to a model of contracting government work to private industry. And we hear the president and the vice president talking about that even now. There's situations where obviously beneficial, but if you're outsourcing things like military operations and the command and control systems for weapons, computer systems for weapons. Donald Trump has been very opposed to Huawei providing 5G technology in the United States because he rightfully is concerned that the Chinese manufacturer, which is inexorably linked to the Chinese government, could backdoor the technology. They could put secret hidden technology within the chips, within the computer systems, the computer networks, that would allow the Chinese or anyone to covertly access that information and perhaps subvert the command and control of the United States of America. You've presented many detailed theories as to how this type of approach could have been utilized on September 11th, 2001. I don't think we're going to get to talk about that too much specifically today, but there is something else, David, in the collage for today that I wanted us to discuss for a moment. We've heard a lot about Hillary Clinton's BlackBerry usage. We've heard about it in the mainstream news. We've heard about it from YouTubers, but in a kind of a vague sense. See, the thing I like so much about what you do, I should say, one of the things I like so much about what you do, is that we're not just here talking about the deep state or some kind of vague them. You are naming the individuals, the societies, the groups, the quotes from their own mouths, the patents. This is documented evidence. And what you've been talking with me about lately is this company, Phantom Secure, which, if I've got it correctly, David, they were actually physically modifying the hardware of BlackBerry devices in order to add a very high level of encryption, and they were catering their services toward, literally, criminal organizations. Can you tell us a little bit about this Phantom Secure situation? We'll talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, the company, Phantom Secure, was based in Richmond, British Columbia, which is a suburb just on the edge of Vancouver. And I think of the 5 people who were arrested, 4 of them were Canadian. And they built this Phantom Secure for organized crime groups around the world. And I believe they had 10,000 clients, right? And effectively, I would say this is the communications network for a RICO enterprise on a global scale, or dare I say it, for a supranational government, right? Because therefore, what you've got if you're a BlackBerry user is the ability to conceal your discussions. Now, quite possibly, I believe Hillary Clinton is technologically illiterate. That is to say, she wouldn't know, a bit like me, whether I'm being shadow banned. There are odd things happening to my website. I don't need to go into too much detail there. But Hillary Clinton, apparently, or her aides, that would give them a very short life, smashed 9 Blackberries, right?
Mhm.
Why? So the FBI allegedly
Well,
was
let's
unable.
address that why for a second. I don't mean to interrupt you, but this is important because it could have been simply because they were trying to destroy the evidence, but a smart person would realize that simply smashing a BlackBerry with a hammer, it might destroy the screen, it might destroy the modem, it might crack the printed circuit board, and it might make it not work as a phone. But if you're the FBI or some sort of sophisticated forensic computer analysis lab, you could access the individual memory chips that are soldered to the board. And unless you really, really smashed every component in the thing, there still might be data on there that could be extracted. Now, people always come into the comments and they say, oh, you don't have any proof of that. And I always like to remind the audience that the concept of proof is a dangerous thing to discuss because the definition of proof is going to change if we're talking about a mathematical formula, if we're talking about a criminal trial in the United States, a civil trial in the United States, a criminal trial in Canada. All of these things have different standards of proof. However, the smashing of the BlackBerry could be evidence that there was specific hardware in there, maybe this chip that's utilized by Phantom Secure to modify the BlackBerry. Perhaps that chip was what was intended to be destroyed. And I know people might think I'm out on a limb here with this, but another piece of evidence that's suggestive that Hillary Clinton might have been using technology from this Phantom Secure company is that we've heard reports that Hillary Clinton was buying used BlackBerries on eBay. And David, that's perplexing to me. I don't think that the State Department has such a tight budget that their employees need to purchase used equipment. And I mean, I've spoken to Hillary Clinton on 2 occasions. She looks like crap, but she looks like a lot of money has been spent on her hair and her makeup and her appearance and her clothing. I don't think she's trying to economize by using old Blackberries either. However, my own work as a 3D cinematographer and a camera hacker, when I built my 3D camera, I had a specific model of Panasonic camera that we at 21st Century 3D had designed a circuit for, and it was only that Panasonic camera that would work with the circuit. When Panasonic discontinued the camera, we had to search around on eBay to find that model camera. So if we've got this company Phantom Secure, that is, granted, quite sophisticated because they've developed this encryption technology, I think it's reasonable to presume that if they've developed a hardware circuit, it's only going to work with certain models of BlackBerries, and when BlackBerry introduces new phones, they might be forced to re-engineer their hardware. Now, if all you need is texting and email messaging and whatever, you might not care about the features of a new BlackBerry, and this is something that would cause the user to seek out these specific models of old BlackBerries that might only be available on eBay.
Oh, absolutely right. So let's back up here. Maybe just flip back to the opening image with the 5 characters, because I think people can sort of key off these personalities into this deeper conspiracy. So what we've got with Bill and Hillary Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton is Phi Beta Kappa, as was George H. Bush, who worked with the CIA. All right. Now, the Clintons, when they were governor and first lady of Arkansas, developed a business, the most extraordinary business, in tainted blood. That is to say, blood was extracted from prisoners in the Arkansas correction system at $7 a pint and shipped up to Connaught Laboratories in Montreal and turned into a plasma that was then exported to Africa. And when they dug a little deeper, they found this plasma, inevitably, apparently, with the prisoners, where there's a great deal of homosexual relationships within the prison system. It was basically a petri dish of viruses that drove, in many ways, I think, the AIDS and the Hep C pandemics. Well, I think they were pandemics, really. So you've got a guy, Bill Clinton, who's Phi Beta Kappa. He was Phi Beta Kappa, I think, elected in 1968 from Georgetown University. He goes to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He studies philosophy, politics, and economics. He's kicked out of Oxford University allegedly for association with a rape and a dealing in drugs. And he swans off to Moscow and squats down, presumably with the KGB, and briefs them on, I don't know, a good technique to interrogate John McCain in the Hanoi Hilton. But I digress. The point is, here you have a president of the United States parachuted into that position in 1993, the year where Ramzi Youssef tries to blow up one tower and crash it into the other. And in 1994, the Clinton administration does some really interesting things, including outsourcing the National Visa Center to Serco and basically developing the concept of a prisoner transportation system, where the Federal Marshal's prisoner transportation system of the 1980s, where I think they'd bought a Boeing 727, was integrated with the Bureau of Prisons transportation system to create what was called JPATS, the Justice, Prisoner, and Alien Transportation System, coordinated by Christine Marcy, Bill McConnell's sister. Now, what that would have given the bad people is the opportunity to fly in a team of saboteurs, which might include, hypothetically, people who had been vaccinated against a virus, to go in and spread the virus in a target community. Right? I'm just being hypothetical here. And the important about that is I'm not making an accusation. I'm just saying the structure of the relationships of those networks would allow a malicious intent to create a spread of a virus that was associated with multiple carriers of the virus into a targeted community and generate the hotspots that we've seen in northern Italy and in Wuhan city in Hubei province and in Iran, although the evidence coming out of Iran is very obscure, but there are some aerial photographs of mass graves. So I think they're being very coy about what's going in Iran. I would think there might be thousands of deaths associated with this virus. The important thing about the proper reaction of the public to such a virus is you need to know the vector that is introducing the virus into a target community, because if it's something other than a patient zero that spreads at random, depending on the contact, but is actually a criminal attack on a country or a city or a state, then there's a different remedy. If it's a criminal attack, you go after the criminals. And I believe Serco is, and they can sue me if they want, is a racketeering and influenced and corrupt organization that has been charged but never convicted of transporting fake prisoners around on the tag, right? Where 3,000 of those prisoners on the tag either were never existed, were back in jail, or overseas, or dead, right? Now, what should have happened is Serco should have been brought before the courts in the United Kingdom, and every one of those fake tags investigated for the possibility they actually had hired mercenaries taking, for example, a weapon into the London Underground training exercise of 7/7.
Sorry, David, we should mention that the CEO of Serco is Rupert Soames. And he's named in this article here in The Guardian. He's the brother of Nicholas Soames, the alleged Mendenhaller, and I believe the father of Mendenhall's baby. So people can go back and check out previous episodes of Reverse CSI and Discovery CSI on Patreon and Subscribestar to learn more about this Mendenhall's baby steganographic message. It's a fascinating story, and David, more than any other show on Crowdsource the Truth, there's a through line in the shows that you and I have done that tells this story. It's fascinating to me because it's so complex. It basically is very reflective of that J. Edgar Hoover quote where he says that the individual is at a disadvantage when faced with a conspiracy so vast he cannot believe it's true. And my question becomes, is that individual Donald Trump? He wanted to drain the swamp, but I think we're seeing how the swamp reacts when you try to drain it. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention about Christine Marcy, the Joint prisoner and alien transportation, the Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, and its use of the 727. You and I have also done a lot of shows remarking that it was strange that Jeffrey Epstein also flew a 50-year-old 727. We learned throughout the course of that line of inquiry that the Boeing 727 has an extremely unique feature for a commercial passenger jet. The plane, which began being manufactured in the late 1960s, it's a tri-jet, and it features this rear door that was intended to be a passenger stairway for ingress and egress of the aircraft. But if slowed down to a low enough speed, just above stall speed, where this Boeing 727 is actually known for its remarkable stability at low speed, the door could be opened at an altitude below where you'd need to pressurize the aircraft, and anything could be dropped out, including a halo team of vaccinated prisoners or expert skydivers or whatever you might want. But you could very strategically fly this or some other private jet, like perhaps Jeffrey Epstein's Lolita Express. You could drop a vaccinated prisoner. I mean, gee, you could just drop the vaccine in a glass vial, or not the vaccine, but the virus. You could probably do that. And if it's so contagious, wouldn't that do something?
Yeah, totally. So maybe because, we'll run out of time, let's get back to the opening with the 5 pictures, and maybe we can convey the image or communicate the essence of the theory that you and I have been developing, that some very powerful people have adopted a template for exercises, let's say simulated exercises like 911, Amalgam Virgo, or Global Guardian, where there are people following the movement of the main assets during that exercise and looking for an opportunity where the blue team defenders relax their guard and stand down, which is what happened on 911, right? So we have David Rockefeller there, we have Wilbur Ross, who was 25 years with N.M. Rothschild and Son, who structured Trump's debts for him in the 1990-91 period, when Trump was heavily indebted and he was being chased by his creditors. And somehow or other, Wilbur Ross, with N.M. Rothschild, rolled over Trump's debts and structured what I would argue are called, or should be called, collateralized debt obligations. That is to say, they let Donald Trump continue in his business. And incidentally, I have that term SCAB, which I'll very quickly mention, which is Starnet, Kappa, AMEC, and Bovis. Bovis is a construction company that built the 911 memorial. Unfortunately for Americans, it's a British construction company. And I say to myself, why is the United States handing off these key, almost spiritual contracts? Because there at that scene, 3,000 Americans, or nearly 3,000 Americans, in my opinion, were murdered, not as a random result of a terrorist bringing the towers down, but by willful intent, for example, 343 firefighters. So Bovis got the contract for building the 911 memorial, and apparently he was accused of fraud in violating the agreement that a certain amount of that business should have gone to small businesses or women-owned company. But anyway, moving on, Bovis installed built the Trump Hotel in Chicago. Bovis built the Trump Hotel in Soho in New York. And Bovis, with AMEC, entered an agreement with Nortel in July of 2001 to install Nortel's fiber optic, wireless, and data links in buildings around the world. So Starnet, as we know, was raided in August.
Now, people watching us right now may not know what Starnet Communications is, David. Give us the elevator. We've got 10 minutes here, so let's just put a bow on Starnet for a minute.
Okay, Starnet between 1996 and 1999 built a global operation for the production and trade in hardcore adult and child pornography. During the period when women from the downtown East Side were allegedly being taken out to a pig farm or raves at a pig farm attended by 1,700 people, where there was a rock group or a grunge group, I can never quite follow it, called Dead on Arrival. And those women, some of them, were put through a shredder,
Meat
apparently.
grinder.
Yes, a wood chipper. Some of them were chopped up to bits, which brings me back to Angela Joesbury, because the skull of Angela Joesbury was found in the fridge out at the pig farm, split down the middle with a hand and foot in it. And remember, going back, I had said that Angela Joesbury, the medallion showing her death, is beside a woman called Mary Ann Kelly. Mary Ann Kelly is one of the victims, the canonical victims of the Jack the Ripper or Jane the Ripper, and her head was severed and placed beside the pillow. And I'm saying, well, isn't it extraordinary the level of brutal treatment and indignity visited upon the body is the same with Mary Ann Kelly of 1888 as Angela Joesbury, who died about the same 100 years later. So wouldn't it be interesting if the MO of the organization responsible for the death or the murder of Mary Ann Kelly was the same as the one responsible for the murder of Angela Joesbury? And then, in order to find that, we need to check, are there any organizations in existence who might have that kind of activity as an initiation ritual, right, for membership at the highest level of, let's say, Phi Beta Kappa and Kappa Beta Phi. So then we go back to 1776. The British, I think, have had to come to terms with the fact they can't maintain control of the colonies because these pesky guys, they don't put on their red coats so they can be shot at easily. They're hidden behind trees. They're sharpshooters. I don't know, you call them militiamen, and they keep taking out our nice red coat soldiers, right? In fact, in Richfield, there's a forest, a little wood, and there's a plaque there to the soldiers of the British Army who died in the Revolutionary War, and it says, "They came our enemies and they stayed our guests," which I thought was a rather noble expression. Basically, they were killed, but they were treated, their bodies were treated with respect by the colonists, etc. But isn't that extraordinary that it's quite possible two secret societies formed in 1776 have controlled the destiny of the United States right through to the present time and are still so doing, using the foreign policy of Lord Palmerston? We have no permanent allies or eternal enemies. We only have permanent and eternal interests. And if you look at that map, that would probably be dated back to the 19th century, and you transfer, instead of the fiber, the cable that's crossing the Atlantic, you substitute fiber optics. Fiber optics, to all intents and purposes, was invented by an outfit called Standard Telephone and Cables, which was bought by Nortel in 1991. And Nortel has an agreement with AMEC and Bovis to install fiber optics, wireless, and data links in all of the major buildings, including, I would suggest, the Trump Hotel in Chicago, meaning it's highly likely that they're running surveillance on every one of Donald Trump's guests in his hotels. And they've built a dossier or a file that would allow you ultimately, if they're so minded, to blackmail or extort. And let me go quickly to one amazing database, the Affordable Care Act, introduced by Barack Hussein Obama, fell apart because the people could not supply the interface for users to join. So they appointed someone to run the back office for a contract of $1.2 billion. They gave it to Serco, Jason. So Serco runs the database for the Affordable Care Act, meaning it's monitoring all the kinds of people who might have to be dispatched through an attempt to reduce the global carbon footprint of the peasants. So I think we have a global conspiracy that's run by intellectual elites and world bankers, whether they know it or not, because it's quite possible if you only see a piece of this, you don't really get to understand. And what I'm proposing is that an organization like the BBC, where I have a friend with the former Director General, I believe that brilliant Contagion exclamation mark documentary, which simulated the spread of a virus as a result of patient zero, we should be able to update that model with a greater number of hypotheses by the user, including the hypothesis that the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg was the source of 10 or 5 vaccinated students against the coronavirus who were escorted off the premises by the RCMP, where we know the head of intelligence of the RCMP is now in jail and a probable user of the Phantom Secure radio system. They go to Wuhan City and they plant the virus in Wuhan City. They plant the virus in another group in northern Italy. They plant the virus in key cities in Iran. And they're basically sending a message, a la Lord Palmerston, we don't like you forming your Silk Road network to try and cut out the Americans from global trade. So here's a little reminder, you better fall into line. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, what happens if the next visit by vaccinated students is into Shanghai? I would say the Chinese economy is now on the ropes.
As is the U.S. economy.
Well, it's very, very different, and we can explore that. If, as I say, and what I always respect about the Americans is you can turn on a dime. If Americans wake up, and that's what the Japanese admiral after Pearl Harbor said, we've awoken a sleeping giant. I think Americans are asleep. They do not realize the danger of handing off contracts such as the National Visa Center or the United States Patent and Trademark Office or the Affordable Care Back Office or the Defense Ammunition Center to a British company, Serco, which has been charged but not convicted with fraud in respect of moving prisoners around. Because what that means is Serco can deploy a prison-based team, originally, I believe, set up by the Cray twins and a guy called Bert Rossi, who was interlinked with the mafia in New York. They can deploy a criminal group with secure communications anywhere in the world to trigger a really lucrative event, like crashing a plane and triggering a catastrophe bond, or 911, like the body count of 343 firefighters. Over to you.
Well, we've been hearing about pandemic bonds. Apparently, pandemic bond holders were losing big because I guess you take out a pandemic bond and someone's on the other side of it. And if there actually is a pandemic, the investors are out of luck. So there's been a pandemic. And again, it all comes down to this front-running idea, David, where having the information before your competitors do allow you to make a strategic financial decision that puts you ahead. We've heard about this for, as long as time has existed. You and I went to the, what was the hotel right outside the BBC?
Langham Hotel.
The Langham Hotel, where they were front running with the telegraph and then the Telstar satellite and now fiber optic connections connecting all the hotels together. It's an amazingly compelling hypothesis. But David, unfortunately, we're out of time right now for this portion of our show. People who have not seen our sponsor exclusive show should join us over on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Certain people are concerned, David, that you and I are touching on topics that could get us in trouble and that we might get knocked off of YouTube. The only way to secure against that and to send a message to the social engineers who are trying to engineer the American public and try to deplatform David Hawkins and crowdsource the truth. The only way to send them a message is to become a sponsor and to join us for the sponsor exclusive shows and to help crowdsource the truth carry on to bring this message out. So David, I look forward to continuing the conversation just 5 minutes from now.
Thank you very much, Jason. Bye now.